The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of this station and/or Confederation College.
Alrighty. Stop talking. We're on the air. And yes, you're listening to Spirit Canoe. My name is Bob Goujon, and I have a couple of literary guests this evening. Joy Asham, who's been on the program a couple of times before now, and Maureen Argis Nadin. And both of you are writers of various things. One of the things you have in common, I gather, since I'm going to actually turn the program to some extent over to Joy, but to co-host this evening. But both writers and columnists for the Chronicle Journal. You're doing the Anishinaabe Voice and the Cosmic Neighborhood. Is that?
It's about space exploration.
Yes. So at any rate, maybe just to get ourselves started, how long have you been writers? Is it so far back in the deep space of time that you can't really remember the beginnings, just like they're trying to discover where the Big Bang started?
Yeah.
Where did your literary Big Bang, was it a Big Bang or was it a whimper? I mean, how did it happen?
Well, with me, it's a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. My father was in the services, and after the war, in 1958, he got a posting back to Europe because he went back in after the war and became a career man. And we were in Antwerp. The posting was 6 months in Antwerp, Belgium, and then a year and a half in Germany. While we were in Antwerp, the Canadian soldiers, they were such a small occupying force that they used to switch duties around, so everybody shared doing certain tasks. Well, Dad one night got assigned to the convent that they were guarding. And the convent was, I'd say 400 or 500 years old. And it had those great big cupola stained glass windows. And it was lighted by his flashlight and the moonlight streaming through the windows. The reason they were guarding this convent was not because it had nuns, but because it had many of the treasures that had been pillaged and looted during the Second World War, art treasures. So, anyway, he thought that would be a good thing for his 10-year-old daughter to see. So he took me into the convent by flashlight and the light shining through the windows. And I saw Michelangelos and Rembrandts and Van Goghs and sculptures and just the most amazing things you've ever seen. And those things spoke to me. And they said, this is the idea that I had 100 years ago, 200 years ago, however long ago. I have taken that inspiration and put it into this piece of artwork to throw forward into the future for you to pick it up and understand. And I felt like there were voices talking to me. That's the point in time that I decided I wanted to do something in art. And I have no visual skill. So within a couple of years, I was doing things like writing stories for Girl Guides and, and taking on extra assignments at school. And I think the first time that I was published, I was about 19. So I don't know whether that's early to make a decision. I never was really able to practice it full time until now. I do it when I can, and I do it because I can't help it.
Right. So it's a drive now.
Yes, it is.
Sort of a passion, I guess.
Yeah.
And yourself?
Well, I'm somewhat of a rookie writer, relative to Joy. I've been writing now for probably about 8 years. Though initially, you know, back in my university days, I certainly always wanted to write and had planned to go into journalism, and life circumstances got in the way. That didn't quite pan out. So I went to university, studied social work, and then eventually went on to work in human resources and work in the corporate world, which I did. And I had a very enjoyable career. And I jumped off the proverbial corporate ladder when I was, oh my gosh, I'm going to give my age now. So
You can do just the decade. Just do the decade.
just approximately 8 years ago, and decided, you know, it had always been a passion of mine, and I thought, now's the time. It's now or never. So I took a writing course, and my writing teacher at that time, Dorothy Colby, who I believe you know as well, had suggested to me that I submit a proposal to the newspaper for a column, something I'd never considered. And yet here I am, a columnist all these years later. So they say that you should write about what you're passionate about. I write about different things, but I'm very passionate about space exploration. I've been fascinated with space and astronomy since I was a young child. Always wanted to be an astronaut, but you had to have a science degree, and I have an English degree. So this is
the
how
English of science.
Yeah. So this is you know
personal.
what Michael Collins says is that what the space program needs more is more English majors,
Right.
and he's one of the Apollo 11 astronauts. So I thought that was pretty profound. So Joy and I we met through our work. And if you remember, Joy, it was back at I think the first or second Sleeping Giant Writers Festival back at Prince Arthur Hotel.
What was that? Maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago?
Yeah, it was about that. That's when, as Joy would say, our canoes converged.
Right.
And we didn't know each other, but we shared a page. We were often on the same page. I would see her picture, she'd see my picture. And I saw her in one of the workshops, and I thought, that's the lady who writes the Aboriginal Issues column. So I went up, introduced myself, and I don't know, the rest is history, I guess. We connected.
And basically that might seem to be a little bit strange because we're both from such culturally diverse backgrounds. Yes, we have writing in common. We're parents. We have grandchildren. We have, similar interests in certain things. Like occasionally, Maureen will take me to the symphony,
Right.
and so we have a lot of similar interests that way. But in Thunder Bay, which I'm finding is becoming more and more like two solitudes of the Aboriginal community and everybody else,
Right.
that it seems to be kind of strange that our friendship not only got off the ground but continues to grow and be very comfortable. It reminds me, to some extent, Robert, of when I first met you. And that was, you said something to me when I asked you a question, and the question was, what interested you in having the show Spirit Canoe in the first place and doing the kind of work that you're doing with Aboriginal people, considering the fact that, that's not your personal background?
Well, a very small slice on my father's side, way back, a couple of generations. Well, I guess. I mean, there's the long story with all the tedious details, which only come back sparsely to mind. I guess there's a few key points. I tend to. Well, I was in university for like decades, right? As a student, 15 years as a student. So I was bouncing around trying to, I guess, understand myself in the world I was in, and was, in some way. So I was doing a lot of that sort of reading and writing. But I was kind of, I think, because I did my MA thesis, but I didn't write my PhD thesis. And the reason I didn't do it, in part, was I didn't have a conviction. I didn't write the MA thesis out of conviction. I sort of felt, I sort of did. I worked in an area I was interested in. But I guess I've always sort of felt I was groping and searching for conviction. So I was always kind of reading and writing and reading and on the research side, or doing the research, but not coming to. And so I just kind of walked away from all of that. Went into more or less around the same time, got into radio at the University of Ottawa radio station. I started interviewing people, and the show I did was an interview show with authors. So it was very enjoyable, very rewarding, and talking to more or less the literary elite of the country. It was kind of waltzing through my my little apartment because I was doing the interviews for that purpose in the apartment. But it was slowly but surely I sensed that I was being drawn to a version of our story, or various versions of our story, right? Our collective historical story, and was kind of becoming aware that I was living in the nation's capital, and I'm going to put it bluntly. It took a long time to come to this degree of bluntness. But I suddenly realized I didn't believe the story they were telling. The imperialist story was not my story. It was somebody else's story. And as I spent a lot of time sitting in a cafe in Ottawa, where I would go for probably good 10 years. I'd go there for breakfast, read the local paper, the Globe Mail, and chat with people, and come back a couple of times. And anyways, a lot of time just sitting there watching Ottawans going by, going to work. I was always been a part-timer, so I always had time to sit and watch the world go by. And realized that the story they were living in, as I say, was not my story, that my story was somewhere else. And so I guess in that period I was doing a lot of reflecting, and a lot of images were coming back. And probably the most powerful image that kept coming back was that guy who's snoozing out in the harbor. The guy snoozing out in the harbor.
Oh, right.
Right.
The sleeping giant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And almost to the point that he became a kind of mentor, as if he was talking to me, saying, you better come back. Home is somewhere else. There's another story. Your story's not here. Your story's back where you came from. Such that, sort of had this profound feeling that up here, we're all Nana Bijou's children. And so I don't find anything unusual about the two of you saying, well, you've found some common ground. Of course, we're sitting and standing, and we were born and raised on common ground of a sort. As long as it's well understood that the common ground is the Indigenous heritage. That's what our common ground is. But I spent 30 years in Ottawa, which I now describe as daily hand-to-hand combat with the imperialists. So I learned very much how they think, how they apologize, rationalize the imperialist story, which helped me, I guess, in a sense, come to realize, as I said, that's not my story. It's not mine by heritage. It's not mine by choice. So I realized at a certain point, because I taught down there in a joint program between Algonquin College and Carleton University for about 10 years. And so I was teaching a course called Technology and Culture, which I've now kind of migrated up here to the content to some teaching I'm doing here. And that became a kind of vehicle for me to explore the historical story, because I was putting more history into. I've always been fascinated since I was a kid with, just as you were saying, you were fascinated by science. I was kind of curious about the big story, how it all kind of unfolded. So I've always kind of read it on and off about that sort of stuff, and realized, as I say, that I wasn't living in the story I was surrounded in Ottawa. And although it was very useful, in fact, I sort of have felt that this was a long detour that I didn't really take knowingly, but I was supposed to take. And I was supposed to learn certain things, and I did. I now know how the imperialists think, very clearly how they think, and how they rationalize and justify their version of the story. So in one sense, that was a very useful detour to bring back here, but I was very aware that it was time to go home. And as I say, I did media, so I'm very kind of aware of media and the role of media. And also very aware of how the media centers, the imperial centers, Ottawa and Toronto specifically, produce media, and they produce stories. and that the story they're pumping out on a daily basis is precisely that story. That's not my story. It's not my heritage. It's apologizing for a certain regime. They do it daily. It doesn't matter what it is. They never stop doing it. So we need our own platform. We have a different story. We're, as I would describe us, we're the peoples of the bush. We have a different heritage. We live inside a different story. We need to hear our stories. We have to stop listening to Ottawa and Toronto telling us who we are over and over, and they never stop talking about who we are. It's very much what I would describe as ideology, and I use the word ideology in a kind of Marxist way. That's kind of some of the. So if you look up the word ideology in a dictionary, it'll say, well, beliefs of a group of people, which could be anything, right? It's not very helpful. Whereas a Marxist notion is an ideology is a belief system that is a set of representations that are the product of an interest, in a Marxist sense, a kind of economic interest. But the most crucial thing about ideology is that the ruling class presents a series of representations not only of themselves but of everybody else. And people internalize images of themselves imposed on them by a ruling class. And that's very much what's my picture of Ottawa and Toronto. They're pumping out images of us, telling us who we are, giving us representations of who we are, drawers of water and hewers of wood, and all sort of feeding into the great imperialist project called Confederation, which this college is named after. Which is, as I've been teaching my students, and so they've now come to, in fact, I now call it Colonialism College, because that's what Confederation and colonialism are the same thing. They're inseparable ideas. So at any rate, understanding that, and with just the feeling that we need our own media, we need our own stories. I often reference Thunderstone Pictures and Michelle Desrosiers, because she's doing precisely. I was sitting in Ottawa, as I often now say, is mulling over saying, we need our own media, and there's Michelle doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of a fan of what she has done. Despite all the pressures that say you shouldn't be telling those stories, those aren't the real stories. In fact, they are our real stories, and finding the energy and the resources to make that happen. So I'm kind of a fan of her energy and determination to make that, against the odds that are out there, that these aren't really the interesting big city stories that should be told. Right? So that's kind of I don't know if that's the same answer I gave before, but that's more or less the gist of it, is that we need a platform for our own stories.
To some extent, yes, that is the answer that you originally gave me. What I'm relating to about that is the fact that because I happen to be a person who I consider to have one foot on asphalt and the other in boreal forest because of the particular cultures that are present within me, that like I have been I looked for a long time, for how that story the big story that has been told us could fit in. And also how, as an Aboriginal person, I'm certainly not the only persecuted person in the world. It is a process that has happened globally.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And it seems to be a process where, like you put the meat in one end and the sausage casing over there and end up with a weenie, like it's a definite
process.
Production.
Yes, absolutely.
Of cloning people that don't question who they,
right.
They've been told so often who they are, they don't question who it is. Now, when I met up with Maureen, and in the course of the types of things that we've just been discussing together, one of the things that comes, I think, clear in terms of both of us is the fact that, we're not clear, we're not people that clearly fit into any of those labels. Maureen's work, and I shouldn't speak on your behalf, I'll shut up in a minute. 10 yeah.
Not to worry. Keep
fat
going.
chance rate.
Fat chance rate.
But anyway, Maureen's history and the roots that she comes from in terms of Irish and Italian, are both cultures that on the everyday person's level have been quite persecuted themselves. I was very interested in something Maureen said to me a while ago, and pardon me for bringing this up, but I think it's an important thing. Because if we're going to resolve these things, if we're going to get beyond, and maybe that's a good title for something, is beyond imperialism, you know, like if we're going to get beyond that, then there's certain things that we have to do. I sometimes say to myself, you know, like there are perhaps in different pockets everywhere, not everywhere, but in many places in Thunder Bay, different kinds of Aboriginal cultural learning opportunities. I have a bit of trouble with that because only because. Does that mean that in turn, once we get finished with doing that, then we go on and do Scotch learning, you know, like Irish, Chinese, and of course Black history and all that kind of thing. Not saying they aren't as valuable. But what I'm saying is this, that perhaps what we have to go back to is basic common courtesy and respect. And that in and of itself, and understanding the worthiness of the other person, is going to make a heck of a lot more leaps and bounds. Then you have your puzzle pieces in place and can add on information. It's like added value. And Maureen was telling me about a term that she, you know, like, while we complain, now I'm talking about the Aboriginal community, complain about the racism and name calling and stuff that does go on, we have to make sure we don't do it ourselves. That in fact we have to ourselves be inclusive. We have to ourselves learn those basic elements of respect and honoring of the other individual, and ourselves not fall into the trap of labeling. And with terms such, let's say, as massing people together and saying white people, you know, that we have to be a little bit more sensitive to the fact that everyone out there isn't exactly the same, because like you said, you have your story. It's not what the imperialists have said it is.
Right.
Everybody has their own story.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here. I just wanted to make a couple of points going back to what you were talking about. And I find it interesting. You're talking about that strong connection to this area in the north, and how often we as non-Aboriginal people do feel a connection to Native culture, because this is where we were born and raised. And if I can just share a little humor story that I'm sure Joy won't mind me sharing. When we first met and we began talking about our different cultures, and would come up in various aspects of discussions that we had. And I kiddingly said to Joy one day, I said, you know, I've always felt bad that I could never have one of those Native names, you know. They have Native naming ceremonies. And so she said, I'll give you a name. And she did. And it's something that we use to this very day. And if I could share it, I am Brave Woman Walks Softly. She gave me that name, and we use it in all our emails and all our correspondence. And my kids find it very amusing because they say it's not true. But however, that was a little bonding moment that we had. The point, too, that I think in talking to Joy about Aboriginal culture and her experiences, she helped me to understand how our backgrounds did overlap. And just through the whole concept of colonialism, as Joy mentioned, I come from an Italian-Irish background. My dad was Italian, born here of Italian immigrants, and they certainly came at a time when there was a lot of discrimination going around. My mother was a war bride, so she was born and raised in Ireland, in the part of Ireland in the Republic, or IRA country, as she would say. And, you know, I'm sure you've heard of the Troubles in Ireland, and there's a strong history throughout my family of, you know, oppression and anger at the whole British occupation and so on and so forth. And I said to Joy one time, I said, you know, I think a lot of people don't understand that for Irish people that English is not their native language. It's not their native tongue. It has been for a long time now, but it's not their language. There is an Irish language, and we talked about that. And Joy helped me understand the commonalities we had of that's colonialism.
Well, right. I mean, both Scotland and Ireland
Yeah.
were colonized. I mean,
Yeah.
the Scots were moved off the land and shipped off to Ireland
Right.
to much as Indigenous people were shifted off the land to make way for a certain economic regime. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of similarities. The problem that I have as an educator is with the education system.
Mm-hmm.
This is not taught. We are sort of fed as I would describe it, the imperialist version of the story, which, I guess I often refer to the old fort, right? 1815. Things were very different in 1815. We didn't seem to flow continuously from that experience. That experience was somewhat, don't want to overly dramatize the term, but brutally interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
There was a continuity as I understand it, it basically one economy attempted to insert itself and replace and displace a previous economy, the fur trade economy, right, which went on for 250 years, was displaced by the Confederation economy. And a political regime was invented in 1867 to make that possible. And thus we got the Indian Act and residential schools and all of that was supposed to make possible this new regime and its economic vision of itself. It would have been fine if that, of course, had happened on empty land. But the land wasn't empty. It had a long history, not only a history of Indigenous peoples, which of course is a valid history in and of itself, but there was a previous history of 250 years that had to be, thus the Riel rebellions. I mean, that was the conflict of the two economies. The two economies culturally met. One attempted to defend itself unsuccessfully to some extent, insofar as, but of course it didn't disappear. Everybody's still here. So the question that I'm always and most curious about now, dealing with, is the regime that was invented in 1867. What's its legal, moral, cultural justification? And I'm not so sure it's carrying itself forward in a believable version of who we all are. That's where the contest occurs for me.
Well, I have some theories about certain tools that are put in place, and there's certainly, I think, relates to like all areas across the world that have deep unrest. For example, the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened in Canada is, like, in the States they had what they called the Indian Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Like where Native people were slaughtered, etc., and
Same throughout the South America, Central America.
What they had wisened up a little bit by the time they got to Canada, and what they did first was send in the Bible.
Okay, I'll let you go with that.
Yeah, like.
But I may have a counterpoint.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Well, actually, both things were happening. The other thing that happened was that they started to drive wedges between the different groups of Aboriginal people. For example, even now today, there is a wedge between AIA, the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, and the rest.
Mm-hmm.
There's different levels of treatment. There's different levels of land ownership. There's a hierarchy that was built in because of the alliance that was built during previous wars. But okay, so they send in the Bible and the Jesuits, and then what happens is that is the whole structure of the Aboriginal community is based on spirituality.
Right. That's where the connection seemed to be made culturally.
Yes.
On the spiritual side.
And that if you happen to come in with a match when other people have to make fire by using a stick and a stone, it looks like magic. There's lots of reasons to begin to doubt, like the things that you've been told. and whether those things are correct.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there was kind of an undermining of the whole structure of the Aboriginal community, as well as such things as, like we know about the smallpox infested blankets and that type of warfare that was carried on with us as well. But, like all over the world, we see that, it's for the displacement of land. It's for the riches that were on that land.
Right.
I am more familiar with the disappearance of the buffalo in terms of, because the buffalo was everything.
Right.
It was housing, it was clothing, it was food, it was even the buffalo dung was used as for fire.
Right.
So every little bit. So there had to become a reason to kill off the buffalo. Is that so European people could wear buffalo coats, or was that for other reasons?
Well, my sense of it is initially it was just simply part of the fur trade, but at a certain juncture, late in the game, buffalo were simply killed off in large numbers to deprive the plains indigenous peoples of a livelihood so they could be displaced more easily.
Yes.
It was a calculated process near the end.
And
But I guess maybe I wouldn't mind jumping in and just the point about the difference, why we're different, and we are different up here. It's partly because the economy was different, fundamentally different. In Central and South America, it was basically minerals and plantations, and even in southern United States, which of course the slaves part of the United
Yes.
States was
Yeah.
a plantation-based agriculture. That didn't, and even in the 13 British colonies was all agricultural settlement by the time, and very early. The fur trade was a relatively short-lived period there. Here it wasn't. It was 250 years. Settlement, we talk about Rupert's Land as, there were no English people there. Rupert's Land was just a couple of fur trade posts on Hudson Bay, and that went on for a long time. There was no settlement. The settlement that existed prior to the American Revolution was, of course, the French along the St. Lawrence. There wasn't a lot of settlement going on. The fur trade actually wasn't conducive to settlement. It was fur trade. The whole fur trading apparatus was resisting settlement because it interfered with the fur trade.
yeah, because
so that
it was
wa-
extraction.
Well, just people roll in and the animals move out, right? I mean, that was part of it. So the Hudson Bay Company and the fur trading industry, which went on for 250 years, became the basis for a relationship that didn't exist with indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples were absorbed into the slave or forced labor economies in Central America, South America, and even the southern United States. That didn't happen here because indigenous people were crucial partners in the fur trade. They were crucial, critical. So they were military partners and political partners through that whole period. It's my sense of it. It's really after the War of 1812, because they were crucial participants in the War of 1812.
Oh, yes.
We would not.
Yeah.
Every major land campaign involved indigenous people. I'm not so sure about the Battle of Chateauguay, but all the other ones, indigenous peoples were crucial military partners. It's Tecumseh and Brock, right? I mean, that's the image of the war. It's after that they are no longer dealt with through the military diplomatic side of the British administration. They become kind of an internal civil problem, and they get handed over to, if you like, the social services section and so you start getting the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857, all this sort of stuff. And this gets crystallized in 1867. This new regime crystallizes the legal foundations for this new idea, which has no legal authority. The legal authority for Confederation does not flow from the treaties. Right? It doesn't flow from the Royal Proclamation.
No.
So as I like to say, when that booze boat sailed up to St. Lawrence, or steamed up to St. Lawrence in 1864 with John A. Macdonald, George Brown, Darcy McGee, and Alexander Tillicgault, the actual business brains behind Confederation, they roared into Charlottetown, got themselves rip-roaring drunk, and just made it all up. It's our Rob Ford Constitution.
Yeah.
They got themselves into a drunken stupor, and then they produced, a Constitution which is booze and bullshit, as I like to call it, because they just made it up. It's not rooted in anything, right? They just made it up. They turned indigenous peoples into the wards of their newly invented construction. They had no political authority for that.
You know, in my own personal history, and then I'm gonna let Maureen talk for
Sure.
talk for a while because I don't want to hog this too much. But in my own personal history, that topple over that you were talking about became like a fading role of Aboriginal people, like within any kind of our governmental structures, etc. Because in my family alone, you can see that at one point in time, we had a lot of prominence. I had a cousin that was the first Aboriginal recorder in the MLA in Manitoba. She took Hansard. And she would have been about 85 if she was alive today. And but dwindling, there was more respect for Aboriginal people back then in some ways. And that is one of the things that has gotten lost within this process, is the fact that I believe that what happened, and this is parallel to other cultures too, as soon as the people aren't required, they're thrown away, and then commitments and relationships deteriorate to the point where now it's kind of us and them. And it's not a place that is good for either party.
Yeah. Well, that Confederation economy was an us and them economy. I mean, when I refer to Alexander Tillett Galt, his father, John Galt, his thing was land and immigration, right? That the immigration, it was in the eastern townships that his father set up. I can't remember if it was a Canada Corporation or something, but basically the idea was land and immigration. And what his son brought to the table, in addition to that, was the railroad. He was on the railroad boards and things. So conceiving the link between immigration, railroads, and land, that was basically the business model of Confederation. Is and as I like to put it, you can't make money selling land to the people who already own it.
Right.
So if you're going to turn this into a money-making operation, and the advantage is, of course, is the new immigrant doesn't, unlike the fur trade economy, the new immigrants in that economy related to indigenous peoples directly, because they were, they were your business partners. They were your mother, your aunt, your great grandmother. But what happened is, and I mentioned those four names for one other reason. None of them were born in Canada. John A. Macdonald, George Brown, Darcy McZee, Alexander Tillett were all born. They were coming over. They were living in a different story, and they brought that story, which is entirely natural and reasonable that would happen. But it had to. It was coming over inside this story of legitimate displacement. You now had the right. Now, of course, in order to have the right to displace somebody, it's very convenient if you can dehumanize them first. And if you can dehumanize them, then you justify the displacement. And that's precisely what Confederation was all about. The ideology of Confederation was thus the Indian Act, which was, the idea that you had the right to displace people, put them on these little plots of land, which were no longer economically viable, and run their lives completely. Why? Because you were culturally and spiritually superior to them. That's Confederation.
I used to teach here at the college, and one of the tools that I used was the movie Gandhi. And I used it because the parallels in terms of imperialism were so exactly right on to what was happening to Aboriginal people in Canada, whether that be, disallowing marriages unless they were married under, the church, whether that be having to have a card to identify yourself at all times, stratification of people into different, and the whole colonial process is wrapped up in that movie, and it is quite an amazing thing to see, like in 2 hours, kind of, if one has a sense of imagination, how we went through all of those phases here in Canada, and that we continue to operate it in that way. Mm-hmm. Now, these are exactly the same kinds of things that, of course, England did to Ireland Scotland was mentioned. India itself, and those are the ways that it seems that the people that are in control of the upper echelons of government or wealth seem to look at others, in not only just the land, but other people as commodities.
Right.
And of course, look at them as a commodity. You do have to dehumanize them and say, well, they're only, like they're vermin or they're or whatever.
Right. Well, it's the same with slavery, right? So
Exactly.
You had to
Exactly.
engage in this kind of dehumanization to rationalize the economic model.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to something that Joy had said earlier when talking about the two solitudes, which I think, historically has referred to French and English in
Yes.
Canada. But,
Yeah.
For our purposes today,
Right.
we'll talk about, again, how we've, started from sharing a page on the Chronicle Journal to sharing a friendship and sharing space, as we like to call it. Joy made reference to a discussion we had about labels, and I really appreciate having Joy as a friend because we can openly discuss issues, and she gives me that perspective of an Aboriginal person. We were recently discussing this concept of, in some circumstances, it's, I guess, necessary to identify your race or your ethnic background. And I was saying to her, I said, I really don't like being called white. And the reason for that is, and I know there's a book and a movie out right now about white privilege and I know there is such a thing, and it exists, on many sort of social and political levels. But my fear is that someone would look at me as a white person, and assume that I come from a background of privilege when I don't. Mm-hmm. And the other concern is, I was saying to Joy, is it worries me that it dismisses the real suffering of many, many European nationalities who were persecuted in their own countries and then came here to be persecuted mm-hmm. again. And we could go on from right. Holocaust survivors and communism and
sure.
so on.
In other words, colonial. But I think it's. I would generally. I don't tend to think about imperialism and colonialism in racial terms, mm-hmm. even though they had a racial component. Mm-hmm. The divisions were often played out in terms of race, but they're basically social, political, economic forms of an idea of how relationships take place, and it could be anybody who could be at either end of it.
Right.
It just so happens that it did have specific racial characteristics at certain points in time, right? But once that model begins to grow and develop, whether it was the Roman Empire, whether it's the British Empire or some other whatever we might be looking at next, I think it's what's important is to understand imperialism, and understand that it is a certain form of political, economic, social, and cultural relationships, and it propagates itself in certain forms. And once you begin to recognize that, then you put up your resistance wherever it shows its ugly head. And it so the dehumanization of white versus, because indigenous peoples will say the same thing. We're not all Indians. Mm-hmm. We're lots of different nations, mm-hmm. right? We're not
legally
all one.
We are, yes.
Right, yeah. But we want to make the point that there's more diversity here than these labels. But these labels come from a certain form of conflict in this case, and I think imperialism and colonialism are still relevant concepts for understanding who we are and why we're here at this point in time, and have certain legacies that we're playing out around us.
I always say something that perhaps I shouldn't, but this is one of the things that I believe, is that the difference between positive and negative, good and evil, if one chooses to call it that, is the fact that evil is organized. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things about a colonial structure or an imperial structure, is it is a structure. Right. It is organized. Mm-hmm. We as individuals muddle through life, and occasionally, if we're lucky, we have that eureka that says, yeah, but I don't fit into that box. I don't have to struggle to try to be just like the Joneses. I'm a thinking person mm-hmm. on my own, and therefore this peer pressure that I feel or the way that I'm expected to be is not something I can either achieve or even desire to.
Mm-hmm.
That I can actually walk in my own shoes. And through walking in my own shoes, I get to know somebody else's. And through that, through being ourselves, and I guess one of the things that has plagued the Aboriginal community, sounds like a digression, but really it isn't, is the fact that there are so many people of a certain mindset that want to be Aboriginal.
Who are Aboriginal or who are not?
Who are not Aboriginal
okay.
that want to be Aboriginal. We call them wannabes.
Yeah, no, I call myself an Anishinaabe wannabe.
And, you know, I don't have any trouble with that. I'll tell you, though, for example, I would welcome you because you've already gone through your own search for your roots and and know why you want to be there and are making choices about it rather than it being like a new age attraction that is
Right.
more like a fad and I want to wear the beads and
Yeah,
stuff
right,
like
right,
that.
right.
Because, like, I believe that one of the things that attracts people to Aboriginal people is the fact that our involvement with imperialism has been a short period. We're not like some aspects of Europe that, you know, it's been thousands and thousands of years. Okay, so we still maybe have a slight look through the door and can see what it could be like without imperialism.
Absolutely.
Maureen, for example, I think has been through that reflection herself and understands, you know, like, so I welcome people through that doorway because they found themselves first. And I think that is a struggle that unfortunately mass media, even though it can through programs such as this begin to reverse that or put the brakes on the kind of mass media education that we are receiving that tell us that we need to be skinnier, we need to be, you know,
Right.
just like somebody else, we need to have this particular telephone, we need to,
Right.
all of which are artificial,
Mm-hmm.
in both appearance and in content. So to me, like, us finding ourselves as individuals is an extremely important thing. And then let's get organized.
Right. No, that's fair. I would agree. I mean, on the one hand, I took the effort to start this program, but because of that need for seeing ourselves in our media. But I think there's also a very other important side, which is you turn them off and jump in the canoe and you jump in the river and you go, right. You just get away from it, which is still possible up here. That's one of the other reasons why I came back home, because I'm very aware. Like, this is what indigeneity means for me, is people, place, and story. This intimate link between people, place, and story, and they move together. And I just don't buy this. Like, if you're living I haven't lived in Toronto, but you hear the media, so you assume it's kind of the same story as Ottawa, Canada's a country of immigrants. Canada's a country of immigrants. That's the story exclusively that they're living inside of. There's no Indigenous people in their story. It's just this was people. Then what a wonderful place it is. This place of where you can come and just you can own it without. It's a bizarre concept. That you have to displace in your mind Indigenous peoples in order to think that Canada is just a country of immigrants. Just a country of immigrants. That's the way that's the story they're living in. I mean, if you listen to the media coming from Toronto, home is somewhere else for just about everybody. Home is somewhere else. But I don't know I don't know how that works. Home is somewhere else, but you're at home. But, I mean, everybody's home. I mean, like, think of the Caribbean Festival. It's all about home is somewhere else. I mean, they're not living inside their own. I mean, it's bizarre. They are, in fact, living inside the story of a displaced people for whom home is somewhere else, and they're trying to pretend that where they are, that this is the natural form for this place, is that everybody's from somewhere else. Well, of course, that's not true. The only way you can believe that is to erase out of your mind, which, of course, the government tries desperately to do. The whole Confederation project was a desperate attempt to erase Indigenous peoples from the story. So you have this bizarre culture in places like Toronto and Ottawa,
And
where they're living inside this, what I would call neurotic story. It's an utterly...
well, and I believe I've mentioned before on one of your earlier programs, hence the driving of the last spike in the railroad, which that particular very famous picture airbrushed out the 3 Chinese workers that
Probably
like
actually
the
hammered in
Chinese
the
did not
spike,
get
yeah.
any
Oh,
credit
yeah.
for the
Right, yeah.
contributions they made
Right,
to the
right.
railway.
Isn't that sad?
Yeah. So, well, but it seems to me that's why I felt the need to come home, because if I'm going to live inside the true story, I guess I have to get back to the place where at least the conditions of the true story are possible. Ottawa and Toronto can't tell the true story. They don't even know it. They're living in, as I called them, capitalist refugee camps. They are giant. They're very comfortable, but they're refugee camps. They're a home somewhere else. They're displaced by opportunity, in this case, economic opportunity. It's kind of a very strange, desperate culture, to my mind. So we still have a shot, right, here. I mean, we're struggling with it. I'm not saying we're living the perfect version of the true story, but we've got a shot. They don't have a shot. As far as that's my take.
Yeah.
And so the idea that the two of you are kind of sorting yourselves out, culturally speaking, that's the working through of we're sort of getting back to where we got interrupted, as I like to say, after the War of 1812.
Well, one of the things that Maureen and I have done in the course of the time that we've known each other is we've delved a little bit deeper too into like larger pictures, into questions about
The
is
big
there-
questions.
Is the big
The big questions.
Did you want to speak to that a little bit, Maureen?
You go ahead. You're doing a fine
Oh
job.
my goodness, hogging the show as usual.
You can
Anyway,
only hog it for 8 more minutes.
Yes.
I
so-
can
But
only
go
hog
ahead.
it for 8 more minutes. For 8 more minutes. Okay, so basically, what we have been looking at in the past and are looking at, hopefully again in the future, is how we come together, not just as women, but come together to reach certain conclusions. Some of which are probably common with many, many other people, such as we're both creationists. At the same time, as we both understand technical aspects of what is happening in the world today and outside of the world.
Oh, yes. Very much so.
And so we have, I guess, come to a deeper understanding that, yes, sometimes one can just be like a horse scratching and feeding in the field, but every once in a while one has to turn on their philosophical side and begin to explore, things beyond ourselves and things that because we have to find aspirations and inspirations in many different places.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that Maureen and I undertook was a series of essays where we called them echoes and essences, like where one person would write about one of these big ideas and the other one would respond, and we went back and forth and created a series of what was it, maybe five essays that so 10 altogether. And we're also looking at a way of attempting to find a role where we can share that kind of, we call it sharing space, because of Maureen's background with space and
Sharing circles.
sharing
Yeah.
space.
Right. Yes.
And because Aboriginal people are sharing space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Of course. Yes.
Maureen has her inspiration is space exploration and the technical aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would be inclined to suggest that the idea that Aboriginal and even like European cultures are somehow or another oil and water, they're incompatible. That's in fact a reflection of the colonial mentality, the idea of the us versus the impossible other, right? I think the sharing of cultures is normal and natural, and it's just as much a part of the human story as anything else. The idea that somehow or another symbols can't merge into each other, that ideas don't merge there. We're always merging things. So I think that notion of incompatibility, I'm not suggesting that they can just blend automatically and become the same thing. It's a creative process, but the blending is
One
normal.
could be incompatible with their own sister.
Exactly.
Believe me.
Well, exactly. This is it.
Raised in the same household, right?
Yeah,
With
exactly.
predominantly the same culture.
Well, that's why I again go back to 1815, right? Your grandmother was very good chance your grandma was Aboriginal or vice versa. You know that the guys, European guys, were more than likely marrying Indigenous women because that's the only women that were here initially for the first long while. That was the case, right? So that was. So the blending was taking place somewhat automatically. So I think it's really important to understand historically when that broke down. And as I say, it's basically after the War of 1812, 50 years later, Confederation, we crystallized this new economy, new political system, and they invented on the basis of nothing other than wishful thinking and a lot of booze. And we need to undo all that. And it can be, and this is the big thing where the idea that somehow or another Confederation is rooted in this legal rationality. It's not. It was just invented from nothing for a certain particular interest to achieve their purposes. We can undo it just as easily. Just as easily as they wrapped it up and said it was something because they got really drunk and said, yeah, this is what we want to do. We can undo the parcel just as easily. It's not held together by anything other than, as I like to tell my students when I was down in Ottawa, a little bit of attitude. That's all that's holding it together is a consensus of attitude. That's Ottawa. That's their job, is to produce that attitude. And they do. They've done very well for themselves for 150 years. But, I'm not buying it.
Yep.
So just a little pinprick and
that.
poof, little pinprick and
Yeah.
poof, it's gone.
No, there's a little piece of history that I wasn't aware of there that
What's
you
that?
mentioned about the booze part. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
certainly we know John A. MacDonald had a reputation.
Oh, no, I'm not talking
for
about
drinking.
John A.
John-
There's,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I've hit upon that in various parts, but you might want to check out Canada People's History, the documentary, that CBC and Radio Canada produced. Because it's very clearly stated there was thousands when that booze boat, that steamboat steamed up the St. Lawrence. They specifically refer to the fact that there were thousands and thousands of dollars of champagne in the hold of that boat, and they got themselves rip-roaring, piss-eyed drunk in Charlottetown, and they just made shit up.
Just to
Sorry,
mention
there you go.
Charlottetown for a minute. I
1
spent
minute. You got 1 minute.
Okay, the Maritimes.
Yes.
PEI is so organized. It is little tiny cubes of land all over the place. It's
they're
not like
that's the tenant landlord
it's
stuff,
not like
right?
the wildness of
No.
Newfoundland or.
Well, they were all tenants, right? It was all carved
exactly,
up, and they
yeah.
were mere tenants, and that's
Yeah.
why they didn't join Confederation, because the new Canada wouldn't buy off the landlords. 30 seconds.
Maureen.
I've enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah, there you go.
I was just going to say really quickly, with my interest in space exploration, and we realize how vast the universe is, that soon we will realize that the only race that matters is the human race.
Right, there you go. And hopefully
Cool.
we do all right with that.
Yes.
I can't
All
top
right.
that.
Well, thank you too, Joy Asham, Maureen Nadine. My name is Bob Goujon. Bob, can't remember who I am. Bob Goujon. This has been Spirit Canoe. Thank you for listening.
Radio, the sound from the pound.